A man can earn a fortune and lose his soul in the same breath. And Thomas Whitmore had done exactly that somewhere in the cold mountains of California, trading his humanity for gold, one bloody choice at a time. The dust of 3 years settles on Thomas Whitmore's shoulders like the weight of accumulated sins as his weathered boots find the familiar rhythm of the path toward home. Each step carries him further from the goldfields of California and closer to a life he abandoned in pursuit of fortune's promise. The leather satchel hanging heavy at his side contains more gold than most men see in a lifetime, yet it feels lighter than the burden pressing against his chest. His hands, once soft enough to cradle his infant daughter without fear, now bear the permanent stains of earth and blood and something darker still. The calluses tell stories he cannot share, and the scars speak of choices that carved away pieces of his soul with each passing season in the mountains. The approaching twilight paints the valley in shades of amber and rust, and Thomas recognizes the familiar silhouette of his homestead against the dying light. Smoke rises from the chimney in a thin, hopeful line, and somewhere in the distance, he can hear the lowing of cattle and the distant sound of a child's laughter, his daughter's laughter. The sound stops him cold, and for a moment he stands frozen in the gathering dusk, listening to the ghost of his former life calling him forward. 3 years have passed since he kissed Martha goodbye and promised to return before the snows of winter. 3 years since he held little Sarah in his arms and whispered stories of the fortune that would secure their future. Now, as he stands at the threshold of his return, he wonders if the man who made those promises still exists, or if he died somewhere in the bitter cold of the Sierra Nevada, buried beneath the weight of gold and guilt. The wind carries the scent of Martha's cooking across the valley, and Thomas closes his eyes against the memory of warmth and comfort and love given freely without condition. He had forgotten these simple pleasures existed, had trained himself to survive on hardtack and desperation, and the kind of hunger that gnaws at a man's bones until he forgets what it means to be satisfied. In the goldfields, satisfaction meant another day breathing, another ounce of gold in his pouch, another night of sleep unbroken by the sound of claim jumpers or the whisper of knives being drawn in the darkness. He had learned to sleep with one eye open and his hand on his gun, learned to trust no one completely and to kill without hesitation when survival demanded it. These lessons had served him well in the mountains, but now, approaching the warm glow of his own windows, they feel like chains binding him to a version of himself he barely recognizes. The horses in the corral lift their heads as he approaches, and Thomas realizes with a start that he doesn't recognize any of them. His old mare, Bessie, is nowhere to be seen, and the animals that watch him with wary eyes are younger, stronger, bred for work rather than companionship. Time has moved forward without him, and this simple revelation strikes him with unexpected force. He had imagined his return so many times during the long nights in the mountains, had pictured everything exactly as he left it, frozen in time like a photograph, waiting for his return to bring it back to life. Instead, he finds evidence of a world that continued spinning without him, a family that learned to live without his presence, a wife who made decisions and faced challenges and celebrated small victories while he chased dreams in the distant hills. Martha appears in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm light of the kitchen, and Thomas feels his heart stop. She is more beautiful than his memory allowed, her auburn hair catching the lamplight like spun copper, her figure fuller and more womanly than when he left. She wears a dress he doesn't recognize, blue calico with small white flowers, and her hands rest on her hips in a gesture that speaks of confidence earned through hardship. For a moment, neither of them moves, and Thomas realizes that she doesn't recognize him in the gathering darkness. 3 years in the mountains have changed him in ways that go deeper than sun-weathered skin and graying hair. The softness that once lived in his eyes has been replaced by something harder, more calculating, the look of a man who has learned to measure every stranger as either threat or opportunity. "Can I help you, mister?" Martha's voice carries across the yard, cautious but not afraid. She has grown stronger in his absence, more self-reliant, and Thomas feels a mixture of pride and loss at this evidence of her resilience. This is not the frightened young woman who clung to him the night before his departure, begging him to reconsider his plans and stay home where he belonged. This is a woman who has learned to protect herself and her child, who has discovered reservoirs of strength she never knew she possessed. The realization should fill him with joy, but instead it leaves him feeling like a stranger approaching someone else's life, someone else's happiness. Martha, his voice comes out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by years of shouting over wind and water and the constant noise of mining camps. It's me, it's Thomas. She steps closer, peering through the darkness, and he sees the exact moment when recognition dawns in her eyes. Her hand flies to her mouth, and she takes an involuntary step backward, as if his presence has struck her like a physical blow. The joy he expected to see is absent, replaced by something that looks almost like fear, and Thomas realizes with growing horror that his own wife is afraid of him. The man who left 3 years ago would never have inspired such a reaction, but the man who has returned carries death in his eyes and violence in his hands. And Martha's instincts recognize the predator, even if her heart remembers the husband. Thomas, the word comes out as barely a whisper, and he sees her hands trembling as she reaches for the doorframe for support. Is it really you? He wants to run to her, to sweep her into his arms and kiss away the years of separation. But something in her posture warns him to keep his distance. Instead, he removes his hat and steps into the circle of light cast by the kitchen window, allowing her to see the changes that time and hardship have carved into his face. His hair, once the color of wheat in summer, has gone gray at the temples, and his beard, wild and unkempt, hides the softness she once loved to trace with her fingertips. But it is his eyes that have changed the most. Eyes that once sparkled with laughter and dreams now hold the cold, calculating gaze of a man who has learned to kill without conscience. I came back, he says, the words feeling inadequate even as he speaks them. I promised I would come back. Martha's eyes fill with tears, but they are not the tears of joy he had imagined. Instead, they seem to mourn something lost, something that cannot be recovered simply by his return. She looks at him as if she is seeing a ghost, and Thomas begins to understand that in some ways that is exactly what he is. The man she married, the gentle soul who worried about stepping on spiders and who cried when their first child was stillborn, that man died somewhere in the mountains, replaced by something harder and more ruthless, something that could survive where gentleness could not. Sarah, Martha calls over her shoulder, her voice carefully controlled. Come say hello to your father. A small figure appears in the doorway, and Thomas feels his knees go weak at the sight of his daughter. She is no longer the toddling child he left behind, but a proper little girl with her mother's eyes and his own stubborn chin. She wears a white nightgown and clutches a rag doll to her chest, and she stares at him with the frank curiosity of childhood, showing no fear of the stranger who claims to be her father. 3 years is a lifetime to a child, and Thomas realizes that she has no real memory of him, that he is nothing more than a character in the stories her mother tells at bedtime. Papa? The word comes out uncertainly, and Thomas feels something break inside his chest. She should know him, should run to him with arms outstretched and laughter bubbling from her lips. Instead, she hangs back, studying him with the careful attention of a child who has learned to be wary of men who appear without warning in the darkness. Hello, little one, he says, his voice gentler than it has been in years. You've grown so much. Sarah takes a tentative step forward, and Thomas sees that she walks with a slight limp, favoring her left leg. The sight sends a cold spike of panic through him, and he looks to Martha for explanation. His wife's face hardens, and he recognizes the look of a woman who has carried a burden alone for too long. She broke her leg last winter, Martha says, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Horse spooked and threw her. Doc Mason did what he could, but she shrugs, a gesture that speaks of acceptance hard-won through suffering. She gets around fine, barely slows her down. Thomas feels the weight of his absence like a physical blow. While he was in the mountains, chasing dreams of gold and fortune, his daughter was hurt and frightened, and he was not there to comfort her or hold her hand while the doctor set her broken bones. He was not there to carry her when walking became too painful, not there to tell her stories to distract her from the pain. He had missed everything that mattered, all the small moments that make up a life, traded them for the cold comfort of gold coins and the empty promise of a better future. I brought you something, he says, reaching into his satchel and pulling out a small wooden horse he had carved during the long winter nights in the mountains. It is beautifully crafted, every detail perfect, the work of a man with too much time and too much guilt on his hands. But when he holds it out to Sarah, she shrinks back against her mother's skirts, and Thomas realizes that his gifts cannot bridge the chasm that 3 years of absence has created between them. It's beautiful, Martha says, her voice carefully neutral. Say thank you to your father, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah whispers, but she makes no move to take the horse, and Thomas slowly lowers his hand, the weight of rejection heavy in his chest. He had imagined this moment so many times, had pictured his daughter's delight at his return, her joy at the presents he would bring. Instead, he finds himself a stranger in his own home, offering gifts to a child who does not know him and a wife who looks at him with eyes full of questions he cannot answer. The silence stretches between them, heavy with unspoken words and accumulated pain. Thomas wants to explain, wants to tell them about the hardships he endured and the sacrifices he made, wants them to understand that everything he did was for them, for this family, for the future he dreamed of building. But the words stick in his throat, because he knows that somewhere along the way, those noble intentions became twisted into something else, something darker and more selfish. He had stayed in the mountains not just to provide for his family, but because he had found something there that he had never experienced before. The intoxicating rush of violence, the satisfying weight of gold in his hands, the respect that came from being feared. You must be tired, Martha says finally, her voice carefully polite, as if she is speaking to a stranger who has asked for shelter. And hungry. I can warm up some supper. Thomas nods, though he feels anything but hungry. The rich scent of Martha's cooking, once so comforting, now seems cloying and overwhelming after years of simple fare. His stomach has forgotten how to want anything beyond basic sustenance, and the thought of sitting at their table, pretending that nothing has changed, fills him with a kind of existential dread. I'll see to the horses, he says, needing distance, needing time to think. I bought new ones, good stock. Martha nods, and Thomas sees her eyes dart to the animals in the corral, taking in their obvious quality and probable cost. He realizes that she is calculating, trying to understand what his return means for their future, trying to reconcile the man she married with the stranger who has appeared with expensive horses and cold eyes. He wants to tell her about the gold, about the fortune that will change their lives forever. But something in her expression warns him that she might not see it as the blessing he intended. As he walks toward the corral, Thomas feels the weight of his family's eyes on his back, and he knows that Martha is studying him, cataloging the changes that 3 years have wrought. She would notice the way he moves now, like a man constantly prepared for violence, the way his hand instinctively drops to his gun when he hears unexpected sounds. She would see the scars on his hands and arms, the evidence of fights and accidents and the thousand small cruelties that had shaped him into something harder and more dangerous than the man who left. The horses watch him approach with intelligent eyes, and Thomas finds their simple acceptance more comforting than his family's uncertainty. Animals do not judge, do not question the darkness that has taken root in his soul. They respond to strength and consistency, qualities he has learned to project even when he feels anything but strong inside. As he removes their bridles and checks their hooves, Thomas allows himself to imagine, just for a moment, that he could simply mount one of these animals and ride away, back to the mountains where the rules were simpler and the cost of survival was clearly marked in blood and gold. But even as the thought occurs to him, he knows it is impossible. He has come too far to turn back now, has sacrificed too much to walk away from the life he promised to build. The question is whether the man he has become is capable of the kind of love and gentleness that family requires, or whether the monster he has created in the mountains has consumed too much of his original self to ever find his way back to the light. The evening air carries the sound of Martha's voice as she sings Sarah to sleep, a lullaby Thomas remembers from his own childhood. The melody is achingly familiar, a reminder of innocence and safety, and the kind of love that asks for nothing in return. He had forgotten that such love existed, had trained himself to survive in a world where every kindness came with a price, and every friendship was a potential betrayal. Now standing in the corral of his own home, listening to his wife sing to their daughter, Thomas realizes that he has forgotten how to be the kind of man who deserves such love. The gold in his satchel feels heavier with each passing moment, not because of its physical weight, but because of what it represents. Each coin is a small piece of his soul, sold to purchase a future that now seems impossibly distant. He had told himself that the violence was necessary, that the lies and betrayals and cold-blooded murders were justified by the greater good he was working toward. But now, faced with the reality of his return, Thomas begins to understand that some prices are too high to pay, that some victories cost more than defeat ever could. When he finally returns to the house, Martha has set the table for three, though Sarah has already gone to bed. The sight of his old place at the head of the table, set with the same blue china they received as a wedding gift, nearly breaks his resolve. Everything looks exactly as he remembered, yet somehow completely different, as if he is seeing it through the eyes of a stranger who has never belonged here at all. "She's grown so much," Thomas says, settling into his chair with the careful movements of a man who has learned to be constantly alert. "She's beautiful, just like her mother." Martha's smile is sad and distant, the expression of a woman who has learned to find joy in small moments while carrying the weight of larger disappointments. She serves him silently, piling his plate high with roast beef and potatoes and the kind of rich, nourishing food that had sustained him through childhood, but now seems almost foreign after years of simple provisions. The silence between them is heavy with unspoken questions and accumulated pain. "The farm has done well," Martha says finally, her voice carefully neutral. "The cattle have multiplied and the crop yields have been better than expected. We've been comfortable." Thomas hears the subtext in her words. They have been comfortable without him, have learned to thrive in his absence. The realization should fill him with pride, but instead it leaves him feeling superfluous, as if he has returned to a life that no longer needs him. He wants to tell her about the gold, about the fortune that will lift them from comfort to luxury, but something in her expression warns him that she might not see it as the gift he intended. "I brought something back," he says, reaching for his satchel. "More than I ever dreamed possible." Martha watches as he pours a stream of gold coins onto the table, her eyes widening at the sight of more wealth than she has ever seen in one place. The coins catch the lamplight and throw it back in warm, flickering patterns. And for a moment, the kitchen is filled with the kind of golden glow that speaks of dreams fulfilled and promises kept. Thomas waits for her expression to change, for joy to replace the wariness in her eyes, but instead, she reaches out with one finger to touch a single coin, her movement cautious and almost reluctant. "How much?" she asks, her voice barely above a whisper. "Enough," Thomas says, and the word carries the weight of 3 years of sacrifice and struggle. "Enough to buy land, to build a proper house, to send Sarah to school in the city. Enough to make us rich." Martha picks up one of the coins, turning it over in her palm as if it might reveal some hidden truth about the man who brought it to her. The gold is beautiful, warm and heavy and full of promise, but Thomas sees something like fear in her eyes as she studies its surface. She's thinking about the cost, about what he had to become to earn such wealth, and her silence speaks volumes about the questions she is afraid to ask. "What did you have to do?" The words come out so quietly that Thomas almost doesn't hear them, but they hit him like a physical blow. Martha's eyes are fixed on the gold, but her question hangs in the air between them like a challenge, and Thomas realizes that his wife knows him better than he had hoped. She can see the darkness in his eyes, can sense the violence that clings to him like smoke, and she is asking him to account for the choices he made in the mountains. "What I had to do," Thomas says finally, and the words taste like ash in his mouth. "What any man would do to provide for his family." Martha's hand closes around the coin, and Thomas sees her knuckles whiten with the force of her grip. She is thinking about the gentle man who left 3 years ago, the husband who worried about hunting rabbits because he hated to cause unnecessary pain. She is trying to reconcile that memory with the stranger who sits across from her now, a man who speaks of necessity and survival with the cold certainty of someone who has learned to kill without conscience. "I waited for you," she says, and her voice breaks slightly on the words. Every day I waited for you to come home. I told myself that you were still the man I married, that you would return to us unchanged. But you're not, are you? You're not the same man who left. Thomas wants to lie, wants to tell her that he is still the same person underneath the scars and the hardness, but he knows that Martha deserves better than comfortable deceptions. The truth is that the man she married died somewhere in the mountains, killed by the same violence that earned the gold now scattered across their kitchen table. What returned to her is something else entirely, something that wears his face and carries his memories, but has forgotten how to love without condition. No, he says, the admission tearing at his throat. I'm not the same man. Martha nods, and Thomas sees tears sliding down her cheeks, though she makes no sound. She is mourning him, he realizes, mourning the husband who went away and never came back, mourning the father their daughter will never know. The gold on the table suddenly seems meaningless, a poor trade for the innocence and gentleness that he had bartered away in pursuit of wealth. I can learn, Thomas says desperately, reaching across the table to take her hand. I can remember how to be the man you married. The gold will give us a new start, a chance to build something better. But Martha pulls her hand away, and Thomas sees something die in her eyes, the last flickering hope that their marriage might survive his return. She looks at him with the sad acceptance of a woman who has learned to grieve for the living, who has discovered that some kinds of death cannot be reversed by gold or good intentions. You can't buy back what you've lost, she says, her voice steady despite the tears. You can't purchase innocence or gentleness or the kind of love that doesn't count the cost. You went away to find our fortune, Thomas, but you paid for it with your soul. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow, and he staggers back from the table, suddenly understanding the true cost of his success. He had measured his victory in ounces of gold and acres of land, had counted his triumph in the fear he inspired and the enemies he had defeated. But he had never calculated the price of becoming the kind of man who could do such things, had never considered that the fortune he earned might be worthless if he lost everything that made him human in the process. I did it for you, he says, the words coming out as a plea. For Sarah, for our family. Everything I did was for you. Martha stands slowly, gathering the coins from the table with mechanical precision, and Thomas sees that she is already planning their future without him. She will take the gold because she is practical and because Sarah's future depends on it, but she will not take him back. The man she married is dead, and she cannot love the monster who has taken his place. I know, she says simply. That's what makes it so tragic. Thomas feels the weight of his choices settling on his shoulders like a physical burden, and he understands that he has won everything he thought he wanted and lost everything that actually mattered. The gold will buy them a grand house and fine clothes and all the comfort that money can provide, but it cannot purchase forgiveness or love or the kind of peace that comes from knowing you have lived with honor. Outside, the wind picks up, rattling the windows and sending dust devils spinning across the yard. Thomas watches the darkness beyond the glass and thinks about the mountains, about the simple clarity of survival and the clean honesty of violence. In the goldfields, he had known exactly who he was and what he was capable of, had found a kind of terrible peace in embracing his own darkness. But here, in the warm glow of his own kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of the life he had destroyed in order to save, he feels lost and uncertain, a stranger in his own skin. Martha begins to clear the table, moving around him as if he is already a ghost, and Thomas realizes that this is how it will be from now on. He will live in this house and provide for this family, but he will never again be truly welcome in their lives. The gold will ensure their comfort, but it cannot bridge the chasm that his choices have created between them. He will be a stranger at his own table, a guest in his own home, forever separated from the love he had hoped to earn by the very actions he took to earn it. The night is fully dark now, and Thomas can see his reflection in the kitchen window, the image of a man who has gained the world and lost his soul. He thinks about the other miners who never made it out of the mountains, who died in cave-ins or floods, or the violence that erupted over disputed claims. He had considered himself lucky to survive, had counted his success in the gold he accumulated and the enemies he defeated. But now, standing in his own kitchen, while his wife treats him like a dangerous stranger, Thomas begins to understand that perhaps those who died in the mountains were the fortunate ones. They had paid for their dreams with their lives, but they had not lived to see the cost of their ambitions measured in the tears of those they loved. The wind outside grows stronger, and Thomas imagines it carrying away the last remnants of the man he used to be, scattering them like dust across the valley. What remains is harder and more durable, capable of surviving anything the world might throw at him, but incapable of the kind of vulnerability that love requires. He has become exactly what he needed to become to succeed in the goldfields, and in doing so, he has made himself unfit for the life he was trying to build. Martha finishes clearing the table and moves toward the stairs, pausing only to look back at him with eyes full of sorrow and acceptance. She does not ask him to come to bed, does not invite him to reclaim his place in their marriage. Instead, she simply says goodnight with the polite distance of a hostess dismissing a guest. And Thomas understands that this is his new reality. He will sleep alone in the house he built, surrounded by the family he fought to protect, forever separated from them by the choices he made in pursuit of their happiness. As her footsteps fade on the stairs, Thomas remains at the table, surrounded by the golden evidence of his success and the bitter taste of his failure. The coins gleam in the lamplight, beautiful and cold and ultimately meaningless, without the love that had inspired him to seek them. He had imagined this moment so many times during the long nights in the mountains, had pictured the joy on Martha's face when he revealed the fortune he had won for them. Instead, he finds himself alone with his gold, rich beyond imagining and poorer than he had ever been before. The lamp burns low, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and Thomas sits in the growing darkness, listening to the wind outside and the silence of his sleeping family above. He had come home rich, but he had returned as a stranger, a monster wearing the face of a husband and father. The gold would provide for them, would ensure their comfort and security for generations to come, but it could not restore what he had lost in earning it. Some prices, he now understood, were too high to pay, some victories too costly to celebrate. Tomorrow he would begin the long work of trying to rebuild what he had broken, would attempt to find his way back to the light he had abandoned in the mountains. But tonight, he sits alone with his gold and his guilt, a wealthy man who has lost everything that made wealth worth having, a successful prospector who has discovered that the richest vein of all was the one he had been mining before he ever left home. The wind continues to blow outside, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of storms to come. Thomas closes his eyes and listens to its voice, wondering if it might carry away some of the darkness he has brought back with him, wondering if the man who died in the mountains might somehow find his way home again. But the wind offers no answers, only the endless whisper of time passing and chances lost, of fortunes won and souls surrendered to the pursuit of dreams that turn to dust in the hands of those who finally grasp them. In the growing darkness, Thomas Whitmore sits alone with his gold, the richest man in the valley and the poorest soul in creation, having learned too late that some treasures can only be found by those who never think to look for them. If you enjoyed this incredible tale from the frontier, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories from the American West. Click on the video on the screen for another tale we think you will love.